We're happy to welcome to our, well, not in our studios, we're out here in the south, and we have Rhyesa Joseph here with us. And Raisa, it's good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we're at Sandy Beach,
In Vieux-Fort.
right next to Marie Islands, Minor and Major. It's a beautiful day here in the south, and we wanted to be here to at least enjoy a bit of the scenery and also to speak with one of our youth leaders, and so certainly somebody to look out for in the future when it comes to national development and so on. Raisa is a board member of the Folk Research Center. She's a UWI grad, first and foremost, and she's also a teacher at the Vieux-Fort Secondary School. And also she has a project she'll tell us about in a while, from classroom to community, and also somebody who follows politics quite closely. So a political science scholar, and I'm sure there's so many other things that you're involved with. So Raya, certainly good to speak with you.
Thank you for having me.
So we just had an election in St. Lucia, and like most elections for the past 2 or 3 elections, we've heard about the youth vote, and most parties position themselves to appeal to the youth. Some do so by using the mediums that they know the youth communicate in social media and so on. One political party had announced a big, bold initiative in terms of the youth economy, that's the Labour Party. The UWP too had its own focus on it. They recently celebrated youth through the playlist, the PM's playlist 42. So there's been a lot of activities that are targeting the youth. From your perspective as somebody who represents youth as well, talk to us about this past election. I know there was a lot of animation in terms of youth, but did you get a feel that youth actually came out for the elections?
Okay. Well, first I want to say that sometimes when we speak about young people, we think of them as this homogeneous group where all are the same, but you have different segments of youth. You have youth who are attached to groups, who are engaged. You have the youth who are unassigned, who don't particularly feel any participation with any political party. You have those within the youth arms of the political party. So when you speak about youth, you're talking about so many youth with different backgrounds. And then when you go to the community level, whether it is in ancillary or Vieux-Fort or Castries, youth have different issues and different things that appeal to them. In this particular election, as you rightfully said, political parties took different approaches to trying to target youth. With the Labour Party, they took an approach that really looked at youth in terms of development and their futures with the proposition of a youth economy, whereas the approach of the UWP, from my vantage point, was one that took their communication into the social media space. So very heavy on promotion in Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, the engagements, the use of influencers in youth and media to truly reach persons or to try to speak a youth language. But in general, perhaps what was lacking for both parties is an understanding of who our youth are at their core, not just trying to appeal at that level just for the election cycle, but consultation on youth issues, understanding what the realities of young persons are, not just in St. Lucia, but your youth abroad as well, who are trying to develop themselves to come back home to contribute to national development.
Mm-hmm. So the youth obviously have their own set of needs and their own set of challenges and so on, which is the key for them because that's what they live every day. And I'm talking about youth generally in St. Lucia, that there is that need, and we saw through the high rate of unemployment among the youth especially, so that was a concern for any national government. But do the youth see, that campaigning addressing their direct needs? Because their needs would be job creation for one, empowerment, education, and also opportunity to earn or to set up business and so on, so equal opportunity as well. Did they see those issues, or did you feel from somebody who's observing it that those issues were somewhat close to front and center?
Okay. Based on some of the commentary that would have been made, and that's based on conversations among peers and also observing what the commentary was, some young persons felt that some of the issues were addressed, but that some core things were left out, perhaps in education reform as well, and having a realistic idea of what the reality is in terms of job creation and searching for opportunities as young people in St. Lucia. From my vantage point, there is in a lot of ways an absence of what the reality on the ground is for a young person. Not just to find a job, because employment is important. I don't want us to disregard that. But because before youth actually become job seekers, they are students, they are members of families, they are members of communities. So what is the quality of life of young people in St. Lucia is the first question I think we need to ask before we even ask about youth employment. So Take for example, it's summertime and young people want outlets to recreate safely, particularly in a pandemic. Do you have a community library that you can go to, or human resource development center that affords you that safe space for you to develop? For youth who may not come from the best families, when you think about the abuses that you are exposed to in the home, our human resource centers and our social services equipped to be able to give these youth an opportunity to escape these kinds of environments. When you go into the schools and you have youth who are in areas that are non-traditional in terms of exploring music or different sciences, do we provide these kinds of opportunities? And I think the answer is unfortunately no. We recently looked at, for example, the results of the common entrance examination. And for a long time we've ignored the fact that we have students who are coming from our primary school, who are unable to read and write. And I don't think that that is something that we take very seriously, or we think about how they function in a secondary school space, what challenges it creates for educators to now try to meet these young people and to teach them a particular curriculum to be workforce ready and to be functionally literate in St. Lucian environment and beyond, because they are not just created for St. Lucia but for the world. I don't think we really consider that, and beyond that, I don't think we take a very serious stance in terms of culture. Ki les kilti nou ka bay mama ino set nisi. Es yo sav ki moun yo ye. Si yo ale akote ka moun mwade yo, ki sa ki ka ba ou la jwa pou fe ko a set nisien. Es yo sa wepon kwestyon sa.
Es yo sa pale Creole?
Oui, es yo sa pale Creole. Si yo weye important. And these are the kinds of questions I think we need to start out first. They're primary, but they end up being secondary to the issues of bread and butter. And it's not unimportant to talk about people being able to live, but life is more about how people feel about themselves, the quality of life they get, apart from just getting a job.
Mm-hmm. Did you see a discerning role in the youth arms of the political parties? We know both of them supposedly have youth arms. We don't know how structured or how effective they are, but did they have an impact? Or was it something you just created because you needed to have a checklist?
I think sometimes youth arms, just like women's arms in political parties, unfortunately become subsumed into the greater machinations of the party. So whatever the party direction is, unfortunately sometimes they are just used to toe the line and to just mobilize. But when you look at the core issues that perhaps they lobby for, you find that it's absent. Because a lot of the criticisms being raised against political parties or even the leaders within the parties, you wonder if there was an active and very responsive youth arm within various political parties, whether certain statements or moves or decisions would be made, certain questions would not be answered internally first before persons ask, but what does this mean? Or why is this a particular policy? Or why is this particular minister acting in this way? Because it is contrary to the values and beliefs of youth internally. So unfortunately, for now, I think that the youth structures within political parties are very unsophisticated to give that measure of independence where you pull from your young people that expertise and know how to guide you moving forward, and where your youth arm can be a check on your political party to say, well, this is not the direction we want to go in, or the values that you are espousing, I don't think that they are constructive for national development.
And those are almost a microcosm of the wider community, because if you look at, well, we'll get to the National Youth Council in a while, but also youth and sports councils. Almost every community is supposed to have one. We don't know what other youth group or agency is there, but in terms of just those two, we mentioned the Youth and Sports Councils, schools, and the Students' Council and so on. They didn't seem to have an effective, impactful role too on the campaign.
Well, maybe not in a very explicit way, but I think, well, at least in my classrooms, I try to have discussions with my students about what kind of St. Lucia do you want to see. I respect their political views, and I always ask them, beyond being affiliated to a party based on what your mother or your father thinks, why do you support a party? And do you agree with their actions? And if you don't agree with their actions, isn't it okay? Or don't you think it's all right to challenge them and say, well, I don't like this particular pattern, that you can change it? Now, I'm not sure if other teachers do that in their classrooms or in other areas, that we have these kinds of open and frank discussions with people, because first and foremost, sometimes the kinds of conversations we have with people are so venomous, we don't get the opportunity to really filter ideas and to feel that we're in a safe space where we're respected. and that creates a lot of trauma for people to want to discuss politics in the first place. So I think having that open discussion about your society as a member of your society creates that opportunity, whether it's in your schools, in your churches, in the respective groups that you fall into, whether you are a lawyer or not, you should be able to have it. And if you are unable to have it, it speaks to a level of immaturity of your wider society.
And I suppose that's how you empower youth as well, by letting them start to have those discussions, forget the politics of it, but just a discussion, an open discussion on any subject once it's of a national importance. Now I know the National Youth Council tried to get the political parties to have a debate. That was always going to be a challenge, considering we didn't know when elections are going to be. It's going to be tight, plus we had COVID and a few other challenges. But we don't really have a structured debate program in schools, or even a public speaking kind of thing where students can come and research and articulate their views. How critical is it that in moving forward that we need to get a bigger voice, a louder voice, a more distinct voice from the youth, starting from as early as primary schools to secondary schools and tertiary?
It's very critical to have these kinds of discussions because they create the kind of citizen who later on is not so blinded by party loyalty that when they see facts in front of them that they say that this is not true. So even though, for example, like you rightfully said, there were no national debates, what was wrong with going into communities and talking to youth about what mattered to them? Youth talking among youth that these are the candidates, but these are the issues we want to let them know matter to us. Sometimes we see development or discussion happening in a particular way where you frame it and you say the politicians should come out. So if they don't come out, you now create the platform where if they don't show up, you show them up. So we as youth have had a discussion in Vieux-Fort, and we decided we want to have a discussion on the environment and equity and fair ownership. So we invite the candidates to participate. I assure you, if the youth make it their business to make that event happen, and they invite the candidates and the candidates don't show up, they'll be embarrassed. And beyond that, they are letting them know that this is what we think, and these are the issues that matter. But for a long time, people don't think that their voice is valuable enough to make that kind of impact, and that's part of the problem too.
And I thought that was a missed opportunity because the youth, it was easier to organize a debate among youth. Even if it's role playing, you don't have to represent a particular side, but there's an issue, you take one side and you research it and you present on it. At least you present information and let the audience decide. I think it was a missed opportunity while you were waiting for candidates to agree, which is always going to be a challenge. It will be easier to just debate among yourselves. You already know your members, you can, the strengths and competencies and so on. So that is one. Now, in terms of a youth manifesto, now I remember when I went to a function and the first question I was asked of a candidate was, what are you going to do for us? And I was telling the questioner that it should be this is what we want you to do for us, as opposed to talk about that. We didn't have a youth manifesto coming from the NYC or general youth movement in St. Lucia. How essential is it that the youth need to start thinking of presenting to the politicians what their own vision is for themselves?
I think it needs to be a collaborative approach. You do need youth to articulate what they believe are the most pressing issues because they're living it. When you live a particular experience, you may be better placed to say, well, I think the priority should be investing in education as opposed to giving us temporary work. But it's also important that you have persons who have been in governance to come, so you bridge the divide and you can share your expertise. So you do need young people to be able to articulate the views of how they want to see their community in the next 5 to 10 years. Do you want to see Vieux-Fort become Vieux-Fort in its true sense, or do you want it to be an image of Miami which has its own kinds of challenges? And beyond that, you need to also understand national development and governance, because there's a lot that our people don't know, both adults and youth, about how government actually operates. How realistic is it to push development projects forward, the financing behind it, what are the stumbling blocks that are impediments to real growth? Because sometimes we sell an idea to our people without selling the full reality of the challenges before them. So when we want employment for them, we fail to let them know as well that the industry setup, particularly tourism, does not really lend itself to us having persons skilled in a wide range of areas that are paid livable wages, that can take care of their families, not just economically but socially, based on the amount of time spent away. So there are a lot of conversations that we need to have in these respects that we don't have.
And that's critical you mentioned that, because I know especially with the tourism industry, it's sold to us more as an opportunity for job creation. We can get employment there, but not for us to become job creators ourselves, where we own the property, and recently I was asking in terms of whether we need another international brand here, or we can develop the brands that we have here and get young people to start thinking in terms of, you can create a brand just like Mr. Butch Stewart did, and then you can market that and you own the returns of it, as opposed to exporting, like the last Prime Minister said, 80% on every dollar, which is not a business model that I think the youth should consider. So in terms of that aspect of it too, in terms of job creation, how much, and I know with the new economy with the youth economy that Mr. Pierre is promising, we're still awaiting some more details on it. But in terms of youth thinking, in terms of themselves becoming job creators, how critical is it for them to think as opposed to just looking for employment somewhere?
It is something that they should think about, but I don't think it's even introduced to young people until after they leave school, and then there are no alternatives for them. So now they try to create through their own ingenuity ways to create employment. So in our schools we have junior achievers groups, and there needs to be greater investment, not just by government but by private sector as well, to expose young people to opportunities where they can think of themselves as entrepreneurs. And beyond entrepreneurs too, I think we ignore the fact that we need young people who are more than business owners. We need young people who are researchers. So we're in a pandemic trying to manage human behavior. So who are the psychologists that we go to for human behavior and development? We are trying to assess climate change. Who are our scientists? Because economies also grow off of knowledge. So what are you creating, not just in terms of a business or a model or a brand, but in terms of knowledge and expertise that you cannot only use just in St. Lucia but in the Caribbean to foster regional development? Because we speak about consultancies and we have to get expensive consultants, but there are experts from the Caribbean who have come in, but there is no space for them, so they go abroad. So how are we bringing them back in to create real indigenous development for ourselves?
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the youth and creating opportunities for youth, there are two areas. I know we've heard over and over again that the youth are not interested in agriculture. It's not something that they want to get into. First of all, is that correct? Or are we not selling agriculture and creating opportunities, meaningful opportunities for them to get involved in agriculture?
I think it's incorrect. And interestingly, when we think about agriculture, the average person thinks about a banana farmer, somebody with a cutlass in hand and into. And that's an archaic way of thinking about bananas, or sorry, agriculture in general. I think what we have failed to do as a people and even as governments is create those linkages, because agriculture is tied into food security, it's tied into sustainable development, it's tied into food and beverage industries, but have we created these linkages necessary to foster that kind of economic turnaround where your dollar is remaining and circulating as it needs to be? Take for example, if we say that we want our agriculture industry to move from just being a primary sector into a manufacturing sector, what happens when a government starts a policy where you invest in ruminant farmers, for example, in terms of getting the expertise, and then in the next installation of another government, their expertise goes to naught because you now want to destroy an abattoir and build a smaller one. So the model is not one that is based on sustainability, but what is expedient at the time. So it goes back towards the nation's vision for itself and creating a particular culture of how you eat. Because when we talk about agriculture too, we need to look at the fact that a lot of the things that we consume are based on foreign taste and preference. Right now, when we looked at the pandemic and we see rising food prices in our supermarkets, all of these things are connected to how we make agriculture sustainable, how we make it national, and how we keep money in our economy so that we're not leaking in a time where our economies are not doing well. So I don't think youth are uninterested. I think that the opportunities created for them are less lucrative. It's a lot more difficult for land acquisition to be respected in their field, to see opportunities where you have these kinds of linkages and persons that, like yourself, who come to you and show you the model of what it is to be an agricultural farmer, or to see CMOS, for example, like Joanne and Dujo saw, and saw it more in a light of how can I now use a challenge to create opportunity for persons around me. And there are young people who are doing it, but the challenge for some is the access to the opportunity, the know-how, the encouragement, the funding, because funding these ventures for businesses sometimes, banks, and other financial sectors doesn't seem as lucrative. There's too much risk involved. So how do we invest in our own?
identifying and creating a kind of a job listing of the possibilities in agriculture, because some people see agriculture as just cutlass and so on, but there's so many other things. I mean, scientists are involved in agriculture, so there's a whole range of jobs can be created there. People who are into testing the quality of the soil, the quality of the water, even working with different species, and I mean there's so much scope. You don't actually have to touch the land at all to be involved in agriculture. There's even from the creative industries, you can design labels, you can help in the promotion. There's so many things that you can do. So I think part of it is that you need to show youth that there's a lot of possibilities. STEM can be applied to agriculture like everything else, and so there's scope. You don't have to be on the land doing things. And we have a good ally like Taiwan who can assist us in that area because they have so much advances in that area. So that's one of the areas I think that youth, even from the National Youth Council or from students, need to start thinking in terms of prospects for job opportunities. But this has to be driven by a national policy, because it doesn't make sense you thinking that way and the government is bent on importing food for the rest of their lives. So I guess there needs to be some synergy in those areas.
Well, there would have to be, and as you rightfully highlighted, there are so many linkages that can be made with agriculture and development, agriculture and health, the foods that we eat, the soil quality. Why is there a high prevalence of cancer among persons in particular communities? These are studies that are worthwhile, but as you rightfully said, if you don't have a policy or a vision for something, then the funding and the requisite commitment for it will not exist. And it's not something that you want to have at the spur of the moment that comes on maybe at the end of an election cycle, that people now see the benefits of wanting to do it, and having a commitment from both opposition and ruling party that whether or not we win or we lose, we are in support, that there is bipartisan support for these kinds of initiatives to move forward, and also a civil society that is engaged too. Because a lot sometimes is left, unfortunately, for political parties to do, but they are not the only actors in the society, and other members must speak and say this is important to us. So whether it's medical professionals, whether it's persons who've suffered from cancer themselves, cancer organizations who now see the importance of saying, well, we have looked at the impact and we realize that it's women consuming these particular foods, whether it's canned or processed, or that our soils are highly contaminated. This is the next step that we want to put on the agenda when we look at leadership and governance. And these are the kinds of experts that we want to come into government as well.
Mm-hmm. Culture and the creative industry is one area that we hear a lot of discussion about youth and also governments committing, but the records show that it's just a promise that's not delivered at all in terms of the serious development of culture. And so you find that culture is waning. We had a declining in our groups. Less folk music has been recorded, and so on. We don't hear much discussion among youth groups. I know you every opportunity you get, you bring it up, the language as well. We don't hear much discussion among youth groups on the NYC about a deliberate cultural policy and effort, some initiatives to promote the language, the Creole language, or to promote folk forms and so on. Is that something that the youth just are simply not interested in, or they need some guidance in that area?
I think a question like that should not just be centered on youth. Is your society culturally conscious? That's the first question you ask, because your young people take cue from what you value. And if you undervalue culture and you see it as a product, something that's just on the shelf or you just celebrate it during a particular month, they take cue from you. And very often those persons who have that kind of internal drive or impetus and see the value of culture, it's because perhaps they've been exposed to it in their community where there are stalwarts around them that have shown them that this is of value to us, this matters to our community, whether it is in Monrepo or it is in Choiseul. We see culture as part of who we are. And the question is, who do St. Lucians see themselves as in terms of cultural development? And unfortunately, when we speak about culture and the creative industries, it sometimes gets affixed to industries as an appendage. So for tourism, so how can culture be used to boost tourism, as opposed to how can tourism be developed in a very particular way that creates a particular brand based on who we are as a people. So when you think of a St. Lucian sound or vibe, it is the sound of Sesen Descat, it is the sound of Denry segment, it's a particular you, it's our language, how we infuse our colloquialisms into different phrases. How do you now see that in terms of a branding St. Lucia? Not just in saying, let her inspire you. Kita certainly see how do you use language now to pull you in? And the persons who are making the decisions, do they even have an appreciation for culture and language, to see it in that way? To view Laos as not just this dying festival among certain people, but part of your national development, part of your independence project. And not just that, another aspect of showing the world who you are and teaching your people, because that's another part of education that is not really integrated in our formal learning about ourselves. What do we learn about ourselves, and do we even learn St. Lucian history at school? And the answer is no. So that's an indictment on ourselves 40 plus years after independence. When you think about development of your people, it's not just about the structures that you build or the roads or the GDP that you can boast of, but what do you preserve 40 years down the line that you can say that is part of a St. Lucian kind of imagery or heritage that one can say about themselves. So when they go on the national stage, they can say, well, this is part and parcel of what it means to be St. Lucian. As much as we celebrate our two Nobel laureates, sometimes very tokenistically too, without knowing who they were, what they wrote about, or how their policies impact development. When you look at culture and creative industries, and you think of in every community that there is somebody who is culturally rich, who may be a teacher, who may be a church member, who may be a police officer, who has so many musical talents, but these things are not even monetized and valued and respected, then that's part and parcel of it if you don't want to even invest in it. For example, in schools, you have the lack of investment in calypso competitions, and you say, well, you aren't interested in calypso, but you've never brought it forward to them. You've never made it something that is lucrative, but you've made tourism very lucrative to them, because you tell them tourism is what makes St. Lucia what it is. That's where the money is at. So you go and you learn hospitality. If you put the same value on culture, where you invested in cultural education, you ensured that there were cultural programs within your school, you paid cultural practitioners, because that's part of creating a cultural industry, paying educators, ensuring that musicians are paid well, and even those persons who have volunteered their lives. When you think about the chanteuses in the communities, those persons that ensure that these things go forward, who really supports their initiatives as cultural ambassadors, or those persons who've recorded dozens of folk songs, who records it and preserves it? If we don't, we are part and parcel of the blame.
We had a good opportunity, and I must say, Dame Paulette Louise did an amazing job in terms of their Creole orthography and getting it into Parliament, Creole into Parliament and so on. But there's a school of thought that we missed an opportunity that we should have done a lot more during that time when we had a kind of a favorable and conducive environment to make it an official language. We know Mr. Pierre from the Labour Party has said he wants to make Creole an official language as well. But in terms of, and I'm bringing you and your FRC connection now into the conversation, in terms of the Creole language itself, a commitment to commissioning more writers so you can have more text to put in the schools and make it part of the school list so a writer can benefit directly or indirectly through it. But also with the Folk Research Center having Jeune Creole, where the language has not been front and center, do they now need to refocus on that? The other part of it will always happen, the food and the festivities will always happen. But the key purpose for starting Jeune Creole was to promote the language, but we haven't had much in terms of the development of the Creole language. How much is the FRC focusing on that aspect of it, or is it status quo?
Well, the FRC has always been the vanguard for advancing language. What has happened is that after advocating for Creole heritage, Jeune Creole, and now having a Creole Heritage Month, Heritage Creole, you realize that it has become a national entity of itself, and also that other entities have now adopted it in such a way that they're not as interested as the language component as we are. So it's not just about the FRC pushing language. Other stakeholders who would now see the benefits of being part of a Jeune Creole and painting their offices in different colors and with different cloths and wearing the cloth, now taking it further afield. So when you see banks like Bank of St. Lucia, for example, having an ATM that speaks in Creole, like the Merci pour Service, that is part of investment in Creole in a deeper way, beyond the month, and seeing that language matters. When you have ads in Creole, when you have messaging in Creole in health, and when persons who know that there are experts around but don't even think it necessary to consult them when making a national independence theme and spelling the words properly, when there is a dictionary, it tells you too something about respect and your consciousness still, because you have to respect something to be able to invest in it in the right ways, because you may know it exists but you feel, well, I can write Creole however I want to, or I don't need to pay this person to write Creole for me. It doesn't matter. But if somebody comes in with French and Spanish
or Mandarin,
you jump for it because you believe it is of value, because as much as we have come a lot further than when we were, there are still a lot of prejudices and stigmas against people who speak Creole, persons who are from rural communities, persons who've made investment that they are not good enough. And that is coming even from within particular circles that know better, that should know better. Because what's really stopping us from having Creole as a formal language is political will. It is political will, because the work has been done by a number of practitioners within the Folk Research Center, of which the Paulette Louise was a part of. But the political will is absent to take it further afield. But interestingly enough, for every election campaign, en rouge or your pair, you know the value of it, you know what it means to speak Creole to people. You know how lovely it sounds, and then you have Peace Corps volunteers who come to St. Lucia who see the value of investing in your language. You have ambassadors from other places who say, well, I want to learn it. But then you don't want to teach your children the language, because for you, you think that it's a language of a lesser person to speak Creole still. And that is still part of a kind of damaged psyche of not being appreciative of who you are and thinking that you are valuable enough. And not being aware too of Creole language as an international language that millions of people speak. And sadly, I remember having a conversation online and people only connecting Creole to Haiti as if that was something so bad, because there's always this stigma to attach it to something that is backward or something that is suffering, as opposed to something that is made up of upliftment. But at the same point in time, you have Denry segments that is using Creole, and everybody loves it and is excited because you have millions of views online. But what are they speaking? They are speaking Creole.
Right, that's true. And so we expect, well, I don't know if there's going to be much focus in terms of the development of the Creole language in terms of investments, because in schools, make it a formal thing. I know that now that we have the commitment from Mr. Pierre, it's not just going to be an official, just a declaration, but there ought to be
a
program, investments, a structured kind of approach to making sure that Creole, and every school bag has a Creole dictionary and so on. So that's also a revenue generation for the people who put the dictionary together, or for persons who write short stories or whatever it is in Creole and so on. So at least we develop that as well. One of the things I wanted to look at as well in terms of the youth and the future, this is what the youth is going to inherit, the environment. I know this generation is supposed to hand it over to them, safeguard it for the next generation, but we had a UN report just this week, and every time the one report is worse than the other. And we not seem to be getting a kind of a dismay, a kind of a shock statement from youth saying, oh wow, we're going to be inheriting this in 20, 30 years, it's going to be real bad by that time. Is there any particular reason why we don't see a more aggressive, a more activist youth relating to the environment?
There are some areas, and we respect that there are persons who are passionate about different things and fields. Some may be passionate about language, some may be passionate about the environment. There are those within the Caribbean youth environment who care about the environment and its development. But I also think too that part and parcel of, I guess, a spirit of maybe apathy or maybe even exhaustion is that there are so many issues plaguing the Caribbean, one of which, and we know that it's an existential crisis, the environment. It's really difficult to put into words how you lobby for youth and economic development, you lobby for youth and culture, you lobby for youth and the environment, and at the same point in time that you would have national policies that really belittle or bastardize previous statements and commitments. So there has to be consistency on the environment too. So if we say we value the environment and we have projects like Le Paradis or DSH and proposing a causeway to Maria Island, you are sending very different signals to your people. When you have persons trying to instill and inculcate within students within school the value for the environment, the importance of not littering, but you have in-homes parents who tell you, further the plastic bottle there, somebody will get a job. It's a kind of contradictory existence that you have young people growing up in, and we have to decide for ourselves what path we're actually going to choose and how consistent are we going to be with our policies and our words in terms of our treatment of the environment, how we lobby for different policies, how we mine sand, what policies, how we enforce our laws, how stringent are we going to be with it, and how we put it on the agenda as well. Because if the environment doesn't feature anywhere prominently in a manifesto or even a platform statements, it says a lot. When you don't even have experts speaking in parliament about it too, it becomes lost in the myriad of challenges that exist for small island developing states, and that is unfortunate. But every year we see the impacts, implications of hurricanes, storms, droughts, Saharan dust, volcanic eruptions. Everything is connected to the environment. But have we liberated ourselves to make these connections, or for our people to even be aware of what's happening around them? Because we've escaped, many of us, not just young people, into technology as a kind of safe space where we live our lives in such a way that we're unaware of even what's happening outside of our communities or our homes once we're okay. And that's part of the problem too.
I have just two more questions. One has to do with land. The first word in our motto, the land, the people. And we've seen instances where it's become almost too easy for our prime ministers, our leaders, to will away land that the youth should be interested in, because obviously if you live here a few decades from now, there'll be more demand for land and so on. Mm-hmm. But the ease with which land or seabed can just be willed away, how much of a concern is that to you as a young person?
Well, it's very concerning, you know, because it ends up being like a foreigner or second-class citizen in your own island. And it makes you despondent about the future, because many young people want to own land in St. Lucia. They want to have homes. They want to have some form of stake and equity. But when you look at the cost and the barriers placed against youth in ownership, they are mammoth when compared with the leeway that is given to, I won't class them as foreigners, but I would say exploitative or
investors,
draining capitalists. Because an investor invests, and if the person doesn't invest, you can't even call them an investor. Mm-hmm. So when that happens, I think it creates a level of despondency, apathy, and a lack of trust in the system, where persons don't even feel like they should even worry anymore, because what is really in it for me? Can I really own a piece of land in St. Lucia? A lot of young people don't even think that is possible, and that is connected to, as well, the ability to be employed gainfully, to own land, getting financing from your banks or your other financial institutions. So that has to be a concern of not just young people, but older, more seasoned individuals, to ensure that land is more equitably acquired in the Caribbean. But we also have the historical continuity of land being in the possession of well-to-do families. So the same families who would have governed for the past 80 years and have economic power are the same ones who still acquire more. And what is terrible is that when you have bad policies being written and abuses where somebody can lease land for $1 an acre, which is an aberration, it's really neo-colonial. And you don't have a pushback where there is a reclamation and there is an opportunity now for it to be more equitably opened to persons who have always had ideas about development in St. Lucia, have had policies put in place, but have never been treated as equal citizens of equal worth and value. There has to be a pushback, and it cannot be just with just one administration. It has to be with multiple individuals, and there have to be protections put in place so that if a leader comes in and thinks that he or she can operate in that kind of clandestine manner, that there is legal redress where persons can have some form of redress.
My final question has to do with youth and opportunities for youth. For 42 years we've had a policy of probably 1 or 2 island schools. I found it strange because I know parents have had to struggle to get loans to send students to study. Some have just not gone because they've just given up. Mm-hmm. How come there hasn't been some kind of an outrage, especially from youth, because who are the ones looking for scholarships, about this policy of 1 or 2 island schools?
I think the challenge comes in when you are being accustomed to living in a box for so long that you don't know there's an ocean around you. So a lot of times our young people, not because of an absence of intelligence or will, have been placed in an environment of scarcity for so long that rather than depending upon the system to work, that they have tried to seek alternative outlets for their personal development. And some have figured, well, although this may not be possible for me in this present time, I will do what I can with what I have. Or going back to land, my parents don't own land, so they cannot mortgage to send me to school, so I'll go to work. I will do what I can where I am. St. Lucian youth, despite the many negative stereotypes placed on them, are very industrious and enterprising, and they will seek alternative routes and see where best they may create opportunities for themselves. But education has not featured in our understanding of development for a nation. And we have examples around us, whether it is St. Vincent or Barbados, where an educated population gives back to its society 10 times over, not just economically, but in the kind of citizens that can really push development forward, can make sound judgments and decisions, can create opportunities for themselves where you do not constantly have to be feeding people from a trough. But I get the idea that in our political development, that we like that kind of citizenry that is uncritical, that doesn't know, that depends on us to feed them and finance them, not because they are vulnerable and dispossessed, but because we've created a kind of obscene politics where even persons who are well-to-do and who are educated come in with the expectation of entitlement that they should have access to resources and nobody else should. And I think that's part of it too. But if we made the investment that was necessary in education based on young people throughout the island who are multi-talented, who have a vision for development for their community, we would see national development go up tremendously and the quality of leadership as well in St. Lucia increase as well.
So in a short answer, we should have
increased
the...
Of course we should increase.
Yeah.
And not just increase it too, but look at the areas where we are lacking in terms of our own indigenous expertise, because we want to make decisions that are data-driven too. So when we say we're opening up opportunities for persons to get scholarships, for persons who are going to go into archaeology, environmental protection, looking at climate change and how we can mitigate and build better resilient structures. You need individuals like that. You need persons who can say, well, the kinds of pesticides that we use on our bananas or on our yams are not good and contributing to cancers in our men and our young women. We need individuals to be able to say that the indigenous bush teas that we are using can be used as a supplement rather than relying on the pharmaceuticals of countries that we are unsure about, and now we can test and do it for ourselves, or at least sell our information so that we can now reinvest in research and development. We need people who can say, well, we have a high differently able population and we need experts who can look at things like autism and be able to see how we can detect that from an early age and make the requisite decisions. So an investment in education is an investment in yourself to see yourself grow beyond your current capacity.
I said just one more short. Since Menisa Rambali, we haven't had a youthful female politician elected to parliament, and last term we had 2 ladies in parliament. We have 2. Should we be alarmed that we're not seeing more young women getting into politics and getting into elective politics?
We should be alarmed, but we should also understand that it's a reflection of the kind of sexist society we live in, and that many do not understand that the barriers for women in politics are 10 times harder than men. For one, you have the duality of the population expecting women to be women and men at the same time in politics. So you can't be too feminine, too emotional, because that's not what we want, but you can be too manly because you're too butch. We have the kind of cookie cutter carnival queen show type treatment of women in politics where their look and dress is scrutinized but not their capacity to actually fulfill the roles that they are in. And you also have the double burden of now wanting to try to run a campaign, but your sexual personal life, your ability to have children, who you married to, being the forefront and the core of who you are as a woman as opposed to who you are as an individual, because you are a person first. You are a person first. And political parties really push through sexist agendas as well with women. Our society scrutinizes them, the media. So our politics reflects our treatment and value of women in our society right now. And if we want to see a change where women are coming to the fore, these barriers have to go down in how they're scrutinized, the opportunities that are given to them, perhaps even quotas being put in place where you don't just want women for women's sake, but you want qualified women to come in, women who can push the agenda, women who can be respected and seen as leaders too, because unfortunately sometimes we believe that a leader is only a man. Only a man, only somebody who can speak in a particular way, to wield power. Traditionally throughout our Caribbean, and we only have a handful of examples of female heads of government in the Caribbean, and that is part and parcel of it, because it is truly a challenge to be a woman in the St. Lucian and Caribbean environment, the level of sexism that you face, and that you are expected to perform even better than your male counterparts with twice the challenges. I recall, for example, and I want to share this, the comments being made that, you know, some of the women who have been elected in recent times have not made enough advocacy on women or gender issues. And that's correct to an extent, but my question is, why is it that you only expect women to talk about gender issues or issues of rape or sexual assault, or the fact that, you know, you have a social service that does not do enough for women and children? Should that not be the concern of the entire society? And that's the problem. You expect women alone to care. But if you're talking about shared responsibility, you need both men and women to have that kind of gendered mindset. Beyond saying, but we need women in politics, but saying that we need people who are gender conscious in politics too.
And looking at the structure across the Eastern Caribbean, minus Barbados and so on, it doesn't look like we have women even close to the leadership who might be succeeding the current crop of male prime ministers, at least in the OECS for sure. That must be a bit worrying as well.
Well, we say not as yet.
As yet.
We don't live in a place of despondency. We always have to push on the ideal, and I think sometimes we give up the ideal to settle. But the challenge for us as a society is not to settle, but to push the limits and say, this is what we want, and we're going to work towards it.
Raisa, we appreciate you giving us the time to come spend some time here in Vieux-Fort with you, and also to share your thoughts on so many of these issues. I'm sure we'll have an ongoing discussion with you, because especially with the talk of the youth economy, as we get more details, there'll be need for more discussion on where we're going, and obviously the youth will always be front and center in terms of discussions on national development. So we appreciate what you do, and we certainly want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing as well, because I think you're doing quite an amazing body of work, and we think that you are the future, and the future looks pretty solid with people like you. So thanks for giving us the time.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.